Welcome to this webinar from PalChase. In our sixth webinar in the Palliative Care in Humanitarian Settings series, we discuss war and conflict, focusing on trauma-informed care. Our first speaker will be Dr. Yasser Abu Jamai from Gaza, the Director of Gaza Community Mental Health.
Our second speaker then will be Father Rick Bauer, who's not only a member of the executive of PalChase, but also a very good friend over many years, especially across Africa, where he's worked for 25 years. Father Rick is a Roman Catholic priest. He has a master's in social work, and he's also a board-certified chaplain. And from the beginning of this year, he left us sadly in Africa, but for the benefit of the world, he went to work for the George Washington Institute of Spirituality and Health Care. And not only working there, but he also works in 2 hospitals, including the Children's Hospital in Washington, as one of the chaplains there. And he will speak to us about trauma-informed care from a spiritual perspective. And so we're going to look forward to listening to our 2 first speakers. And after that, I will introduce our panel.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm really glad to be on this platform. It's already exciting to see so many people coming from different locations, different areas, different timing, and I understand very well why we have to do it twice, once today and the other time is tomorrow morning. I'll start with showing some slides, and I hope that I'll be able to give you a brief idea on the kind of care that we offer in Gaza, and at the same time to touch upon issues related to palliative care or to care for caregivers or stress management and these other titles, And to begin with, we are a non-government organization that started to operate in the year 1990. We were established by a renowned psychiatrist and the human rights advocate, Iyad al-Sarraj, Dr. Iyad al-Sarraj. And the idea, when we began, began in the late 80s, because in Gaza, then we had only one psychiatric hospital and there was no other service. It was during the first Intifada, and the question was all the time, how can we provide care to families, to the children who were simply challenged by the daily realities of the occupation, including what was happening during the night, the Intifada, like night raiding of houses, homes, etc., etc., etc. So the idea was to let's begin to try to address the needs of the families, of the children, of the women, of the people who are exposed on a daily basis to the violations of human rights caused by the occupation. In order to do that, to be successful, and after consulting with many international colleagues and experts in the field, he thought that the best way to do things is to just follow a biopsychosocial model of intervention. Now it's sometimes called biopsychosocial rehabilitation model of intervention, etc., etc. But the idea is that we do not really need to focus only on the medical aspect, the biological aspect. But we have to take in mind the psychological aspects. We have to take in mind the socioeconomic conditions, the living conditions, the family conditions, and all other issues that are around the life of the people. Because in a place when you live under occupation, you are exposed to different violations of human rights. You cannot really think of just the biological essence of illnesses. You cannot only attribute depression to a disturbance in transmitters, etc., etc. When we look at Gaza today, which is 32 years from 1990, we see very simple but crazy, if I could say, figures. The population is more than 2 million people. It's not a big population, but it's in a very small geographical area, which is about 360 square kilometers. The density is about 5,000 people per square kilometers, or 13,000 people per square miles. Among those, more than 50% are below the poverty, according to OCHA in 2021. Unemployment rate is almost also 49%. Sometimes it goes up to more than 50%. Sometimes it goes back to about 46%. The other staggering issue is that about 80% of the population are dependent on international assistance. Now, the question is why we are there, why we have such a very dense population, the very big reason, which is that 67% or 2/3 of the population are refugees, who are people who are uprooted from their own living places between until the year 1948. And then that's not the only issue about Gaza Strip. If you think really about the place, you will have in your mind different, things that you could think of. It's not only the occupation, it's also a siege that is embarked, or a blockade that began 15 years ago and continues until now. Restriction of movement, some of the goods are not allowed to get into Gaza, etc., etc., etc. It's not only that you have the highly densely population with 2/3 of them refugees, it's not only that you are living under blockade, but also within those 15 years, we were exposed to 4 military operations, or 4 what we call offensives. One in 2009, the other in 2012, the third in 2014, and the last one was in May last year, 2021. Sometimes we call them 4 offensives, sometimes we just count the days. 2009 it was 22, 2012 was 8, 2014 52, 2021 11 days. So sometimes we sum it as days, sometimes we just call it as different offensives. Why I talk about this? Because of the very simple issue, which is that between those attacks, we as residents, we really do not feel that we are safe. It's not getting back to a safe area, to a comfortable living zone. Why? Because the blockade is still there, the occupation is still there, the economic hardship is still there. Every now and then there are expectations that there will be another attack. So people are all the time feeling that as if they are living on the edge. That's why in 2018, there were a lot of demonstrations in Gaza that continued for about a year. Great March of Return demonstrations. Those were mainly civil demonstrations. However, the harsh response by the Israeli army caused thousands of people who got wounded, tens of amputations, more than 7,000 people with life ammunition wounds, etc., etc., etc. So there are some other difficulties that we are facing, and like the international community, we had our own share of COVID-19 that continued for 2 years, and now, by the way, we are on the edge of the 5th, let me say, wave. It started about a few days ago. Of course, with each thing, you have a number of people who were killed, who were wounded. Usually 1/3 are children, usually 1/4 are women, usually 70 to 75% of the people who got injured, killed, wounded, etc., etc., who are basically civilians. One would say, how are people dealing with that? How is the psychological impact? I'm not going to focus on this for today. I'm going to focus more on care. But for example, a report, I'd like to ask everyone to look into the reports that are shared by various actors, international actors and local actors in Palestine, commemorating, for example, 15 years of blockade. For example, Save the Children issued a report less than 2 weeks ago. Among the key findings, I picked 2 because they are very important. The first one is that regarding children, imagine that 90% of children feel less safe when away from their parents. So the concept of safety is still a big challenge and a big issue in a place like Gaza Strip, although these data were collected 10 months after the last May attack. It was in March and in April. On the other hand, the caregivers, and this is again another challenge, caregivers, we speak about here parents when it comes to children, about 96% of them, they feel unhappy and constantly anxious. When we ask why you are feeling unhappy or constantly anxious, of course, because there is nothing that you can do in your hand. 63% of caregivers feel they are not useful. 61% report inability to overcome difficulties. Difficulties not only the crowdedness, the housing, but also difficulties with socioeconomic conditions with just affording a good life for their children. Now, when you come to a place like Gaza Strip, the question is, who are the people who are providing some care? This intervention pyramid is widely used nowadays in humanitarian, let me say, response. It begins with a very wide title of social considerations in basic services and security, and ends up with the specialized mental health services, which is therapy and care. And in the middle, there are different interventions, more like counseling, more than specialized support, sort of this and sort of that. In a place like Gaza Strip, the Ministry of Health, mainly with GCMHP, are involved in the provision of specialized mental health services. But imagine that the overall number of therapists who can provide this service in both organizations or institutions is less than 200 people. When we speak about a population of 2 million people, we speak about less than 20 psychiatrists in both areas. So you can imagine how difficult or how challenging it is to provide care for the people who are in need. Of course, in the other layers of intervention, the more, let me say, basic ones, you have many local and non-governmental organizations, international non-governmental organizations, and many other key actors. And then I would like to begin to show this photo, or this, I don't know how to call it. It's imagery that was provided by one of the international organizations. It shows how, or areas that were attacked or targeted during the 2021 attacks. The idea is that this is slight or very small geographical area, Gaza Strip, which is about 6 to 8 miles in width, or maybe 14 to 16 kilometers in width, and about 40 kilometers in length, or 26 miles in length. Oh, sorry about that. You see that almost every place was attacked one way or the other. So the bombardment, the shelling was felt, was heard almost everywhere. So this is the southern area. You can see in green or in yellow or in orange that areas were bombed during the 11-day attack. If you go a little bit to the north, to the northern area, you will see that the same things happening. It's even more dense. So we do not speak only about providing care for people who come to your community centers, to the traumatized ones, because not many of them come to your place. Why? Because a population of more than 2 million people, where almost everyone exposed to some sort of traumatic event. The exposure level to, for example, hearing bombardment, being terrified, sometimes go to, according to some research, to more than 97%. And then the question is, what have I done? Now the question is, next slide. When you have a crisis, building on another crisis, when you have an acute condition building on a chronic conditions, what can you do? And when you are in GCMHP, Gaza Community Mental Health Program, expected to start to have a crisis response plan. Of course, we do the very main things. We begin with the very basic thing, which is the provision of psychological first aid. It's an internationally accredited, known, let me say, standardized technique that you need to provide immediately. When you speak about 2 million people, you cannot, of course, go to visit everyone. What can you do? You need basically to identify the key or the main people who were affected. Main people, which means the most exposed people. That could be the neighborhoods that were more bombed than the other neighborhoods. It could be families of the injured people, families of the killed people or wounded people. And then there is a big question about, we need to offer more help. We need to offer more accessible help. So you try to have a toll-free line, where people can call you, especially in a place like the Middle East. There are some issues with stigma. Mental health is something that is stigmatizing, was stigmatizing, and will continue to be stigmatizing wherever you are. So you need to keep this in your mind, and you need to offer some space for people who could approach you to make sure or to ensure that are they in need for your service or not? Telephone counseling is another important service that we expand. It continues to be there, but we expand during the crisis, which means adding more staff, adding more time, operating during the weekends, etc., etc. And then you have to send your community, your teams to the community, because you need to visit houses. We usually send pairs of a man and a woman, both psychologists. They go to visit the houses. They start with the most affected areas, and they try to provide basic counseling, some assessment, and detect cases that need more care and refer them to our community centers, where we provide specific counseling or therapy, the traditional, let me say, psychiatric, psychological, therapeutic approaches. Now, at the same time, let's say that having in mind the previous, let me say, map of Gaza Strip, where everyone was affected, we will notice that even the ones who provide care are or were exposed to the traumatic conditions, because when you see that the parents say that we feel that we are useless, we cannot help, we couldn't help our children, feel them protected. Well, I had the same feeling. I couldn't really protect my children. I couldn't tell them that everything will be fine tomorrow morning, because they know that we will not, it will not be for sure okay until or normal or good until there is a ceasefire that is reachable. So for that, we need to, we have a different or another pyramid, if I could say, which is to work with caregivers. And this is again a multi-layer intervention. Psychoeducation, you need to tell everyone the lessons that they need to understand, especially to parents. You know, when your child starts to behave in a very abnormal way, you need to make sure that you understand that this could be a sign of a trauma, and that with listening, with offering more hugging, with offering more containment, then your child will start to improve. You need to tell the parents, to send them the message, to send the message to the whole community, what they should do, how they should react. And then you speak about people who are in the front line, you know, and this could be medical staff, this could be mental health workers, and this could be ambulance drivers, and this could be journalists, for example. This could be civil defense actors. Here we have two modalities. One is stress management, which is basically to have 1 or 2 sessions for stress management every now and then to help them know how to deal with their stresses, how to ventilate, how to, for example, to make or provide deep breath, etc., or breathing exercises, etc., etc. Some of the organizations, they are not really into a systematic program that offers care for caregivers on, for example, weekly or bi-weekly basis. That's why we end up just having some stress management, we call a session every now and then, based on their request or based on the need of people. However, more structured is the very important thing. And for that, we have either care for caregivers, which is like a session each second week, or we have something that is called supervision, which is aimed at mainly mental health providers, because as a mental health professional, you need at the end of the day to empty your cup in order to be able to provide more people, because you see cases on everyday basis. You hear the difficult stories. You have lived through these conditions. You understand really what it means, and you are expected to provide care. You need all the time to empty your cup before being able to take more information, listen to more people, and of course, provide more care. Without this parallel system, the first one will never work. You cannot really help others when you feel that you are paralyzed, when you feel that you don't have anything in hand that you could provide to your family, to yourself, and to everyone else. These are some of the pictures, some of the photos. These are ambulance drivers. We have provided throughout 6 months period stress management and care for caregivers for the mainly stress management to almost everyone in the ambulance drivers field in the Ministry of Health. Those are, I think, 190 people. And part of it was fun, part of it was talk therapy, part of it was building, let me say, group dynamics, and it all went really very well. And imagine when we speak about decades, of those difficulties, that was almost the very first kind of, let me say, help that they received in a very systematic way. So it's very important all the time not to think of one-shot stress management, but it's all the time it's important to provide something for at least 3 months, maybe 6 months period, in order to feel that you have done something good. There are some other issues, you need to ensure accessibility when you provide care to the whole community. We have 3 main community centers. Those are in blue, light blue, but also we are present in some community-based organizations. We send psychologists to operate from there. And these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 areas. So we can find 5 access points or 5 accessibility centers to our community centers, while traditionally we used to have only 3. Of course, this is in addition to our toll-free line. These are some of the colleagues who are visiting some of the families in the field. And this is one of my colleague, a psychologist, who is working with an 11-year-old girl in our play therapy room. So this is in short what I would like to say, but I would like to end up with Save the Children report. It says that reversing the impact of the current living conditions, there are needs for 2 things. One is to put an end to the most significant stressor in children's life, which is the conflict itself, the violence, the economic deprivation. The second is to help the people cope, improve their resilience, and be able to go on with their lives in Gaza. And I, as a Palestinian who live in Gaza, I would say that none of those will be able to be achieved without ending the blockade and putting an end to the ongoing occupation that is going for decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yasser. I know that there are many people who ask questions, but I think we're going to leave that till after Father Rick has spoken and we've had our panel involved. But I, for one, have taken so much learning from you. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your amazing program and all that you have achieved. And so now I hand you over to Father Rick Bauer to speak to us about the spiritual aspect of trauma and humanitarian crises. Thank you, Rick.
Well, great, and I trust you can all see my slides and hear me. Thank you very much, Dr. Yasser. Remind me never to follow you in a meeting. What a wonderful, wonderful, important presentation. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the, the spiritual care. And in 20 minutes, can't do a whole lot. But I kind of want to do an overview of what is spiritual care in palliative care in humanitarian crisis, and then what is trauma-informed or what is disaster spiritual care, because that's kind of a subset of this. And I agree 110% with my colleague a little bit about caring for the caregiver, the spiritual self-care, and so that we look at each one of these. Again, when we're talking about spiritual care, spirituality and religion, for some people, are related, but they are distinct constructs. And if we're going to provide palliative care, caring for the human spirit is essential, because both children and adults need to attribute meaning to illness, to death, to trauma, to disaster. Why is this happening? I love the work I do because I keep finding out that traditional Western, Eastern beliefs and theologies and approaches to health and healing and illness and death and dying and living weave together in very complex ways as people create meaning out of a life-threatening illness or a life-threatening situation. I want to stress, you do not have to know the answers. What we do need to be is actively present. And I get it, that talking about suffering and death and trauma can be countercultural in most settings. I add this when we're talking disaster and trauma. We want to provide comfort without re-traumatizing. And sometimes the best well-meaning, forcing clients to talk about an experience they don't want to talk about. So we have to highlight that we do not re-traumatize people, but we need to be in the presence of suffering, of lamentations, and not run away. We always talk in palliative care about this generalist specialist model. I believe every physician, nurse, social worker, counselor, chaplain, nutritionist, every healthcare worker needs a basic understanding of palliative care. We all need to know how to screen for physical pain, for psychosocial pain, for trauma, and spiritual distress. Then there's additional education that we get certified as a specialist in palliative care or certified as a specialist in trauma care. So today we just want to create kind of some more generalists. I know some of you are specialists here. What are we talking about with spiritual care? And this is this dynamic, it changes, intrinsic, it's part of all of us, aspect of humanitarian, through which people seek ultimate meaning, purpose, transcendent, experience a relationship to self, family, others, community, society, nature, and for some, the significant or sacred. Spirituality is expressed through beliefs, values, traditions, practices. So when I'm looking at screening and assessing and understanding another spiritual beliefs, I'm always looking at meaning, purpose, and connectedness. How does this person stay connected with those around them, the world, the universe, God, if they're a believer? Spiritual distress, and that's what we're looking for in palliative care. You physicians and doctors, you're looking for, the physical pain. The psychiatrists, the psychologists, you're looking for emotional pain. But we also have to understand that spiritual distress, that inability to experience and integrate meaning and purpose in life by being connected with yourself, with others, art, music, literature, nature, and or a power greater than oneself. One of my favorite quotes is that suffering is not a question that demands an answer. It's not a problem that requires a solution. It's a mystery that demands a presence. We need to be present to suffering. That is not to say we don't work. I'm a deep believer in advocacy, that we don't work to advocate for the end of what's causing the trauma in Gaza. We work to make sure we can access analgesic medication, in countries where people need palliative care. We work and advocate that spiritual care is an essential component of palliative care. But when I'm with a patient right here, right now, sometimes the most valuable thing I can do is to fully, actively be present to someone who's undergoing, sometimes for me, unimaginable suffering. One definition of spiritual care that I really like comes from our colleagues, thank you, Moira, in Scotland, from the NHS. That's the care that recognizes, responds to the needs of the human spirit when faced with trauma, ill health, sadness. It can include that need for meaning and self-worth to express oneself. It can mean faith support, for ritual, for sacraments, for prayer, for reading of sacred texts, or rites and sacraments. or it can be that sensitive, active listening. It's not passive listening. It's truly being present to our patients, to our clients. Spiritual care begins when we encourage human contact in a compassionate relationship and moves in whatever direction the patient says. Because always in palliative care, this is patient-centered care. It's not about Father Rick's personal religious or spiritual beliefs. It's about your personal religious spiritual beliefs and what you need for healing and for wholeness. Compassionate listening is listening to that inner story. It's deep listening. It's listening to what the client says, how it's said, but it's also listening to what is not being said. It's listening for spiritual things as I'm, tell me how you're doing. Tell me more. What's going on in your life? I point to IV poles. How are you dealing with all of this? And I'm listening, especially in my role as chaplain, for those spiritual things. How is meaning? Does this person have a purpose? How are they experiencing hope, connectedness, acceptance, or the lack of these? I'm listening also, not only for spiritual distress, but this is my social work background, is that we also want to look for the strengths. I want to know every person has spiritual resources and strengths, but sometimes a disaster or a trauma, and especially ongoing trauma, hides those, it puts them into the background. And our role as caregivers, as clinicians, is to listen and identify some of those, those spiritual sources, the spiritual resources of strength, and helping patients make the connection between their spirituality, their meaning and their purpose, their well-being, and their coping. These are two slides I just love, and I know my gosh, the time is flying, but we'll send these slides. This is looking at a wonderful slide for spiritual care. What am I looking at as a chaplain about those spiritual needs of connection, peace, meaning, purpose, transcendence? What are the strengths of this individual? And then where is the distress? So that ultimately I want to put spiritual needs into the treatment plan, both in palliative care as well as trauma. Oops. The same is true for children, and our children have spiritual needs, which may be the different or the same, or usually different, in my experience, than their parents. And children have those deep spiritual needs of love, faith, hope, integrity, and beauty. I look at, I cringe when I go into Children's Hospital and there's that sign on the door, male caregivers, please see nurse before entering the room. And I know what that means. And it breaks my heart, that this is that trauma that someone's going through. And so how do then we create healing from that? Moving a bit to disaster spiritual care is a process through which individuals, families, communities affected by a disaster, affected by trauma, draw upon their rich heritage of faith, hope, community, and meaning as a source of strength that can bolster the recovery process. So often, and I hope this is changing in the United States with VOAD is really pushing this, that spiritual care needs to be a part, integral to disaster care. I get it. If someone's bleeding, screaming in pain, that's not the time to do a spiritual assessment. I get it. But don't say that can wait days or weeks to do that either if we're going to be doing comprehensive care. Because the spiritual strength can be an essential part of that person's recovery process. We need to integrate spiritual care into disaster and trauma responses. How that person gets meaning, purpose, and connectedness, it's essential to all of us, whether you're atheist, agnostic, or a deep believer. It's part of who we are. And disasters significantly disrupt people's spiritual lives. It may be their religious beliefs and practices. It may be how they get meaning. But the World Health Assembly, that definition, I put it up here constantly. Early identification and correct assessment and treatment of pain and other problems, whether physical, psychosocial, or spiritual. It's in the definition. And if we avoid this, again, we're not doing comprehensive palliative care. And more importantly, we may be ignoring a deep source of pain and suffering that we could alleviate with a client that we're treating. Disaster spiritual care is unique. The disaster spiritual care provider engages in concentrated spiritual care during there's waves of this critical stress that are often frequent and intense. Why did God allow this to happen? Screaming at me. Where is God in all of this? As people, as spiritual care providers worked at the Twin Towers after 9/11. It's of duration, and it's different than the spiritual care that's kind of normal in my day-to-day rounding in the hospital or in the setting in a mosque, a church, or a temple. It's the severity of the disaster that requires well-trained and credentialed disaster spiritual care providers. The goals of disaster spiritual care is much like what Yasser talked about, what all of you, the physicians and nurses, talk about. We want to stabilize after the initial impact of the disaster. We want to reduce symptoms. We want to promote resilience and coping. And hopefully we want to return to an adaptive functioning, or it may be referral for, as Dr. Yasser said, to therapy or ongoing spiritual care. Dr. Yasser also mentioned psychological first aid. And and again, he talked about this. I don't want to repeat it, but I want, pardon me? Okay, so that we have to listen, but don't pressure people to talk. This is so key that we don't re-traumatize people. We have to take care of ourselves. That expectation that we as care providers can be immersed in suffering and loss and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as walking through water and not getting wet. If you're involved with this, you need to have a spiritual self-care plan. That may be your own religious rituals, meditation, how you create meaning, purpose, and connectedness. Self-care is in all of our religious traditions, and we need, if you are religious, to adapt to those. And finally, write it out. For me, if it's my self-care plan isn't concrete, isn't in my diary, it doesn't happen. And with that, I will turn over.
Thank you so much, Rick. And as always, really powerful advocacy for the importance of spiritual care in palliative care, but so especially in disaster areas. So thank you again. We are going to now to introduce our respected panel, who will each comment on the same issue. And so I'd like to introduce Anne Kellerman, who is a social worker in palliative care from the MedStar Hospital in Washington and DC. A dear friend, Maria Winiecka, who is a psychologist from the Soul Psychology Center in Kyiv in Ukraine, who is doing amazing outreach work to people who are traumatized in Ukraine, and Dr. Christina Puchalski, who leads the George Washington Institute of Spirituality and Healthcare, and of course is a world-renowned leader in this field and a very compassionate palliative care physician. And as I know, Anne, that you need to leave soon, I would like to ask you, first of all, if you would like to comment on your experiences and understanding of this issue of trauma response in humanitarian settings. Sorry, is Anne there?
Can you hear me okay? I was just unmuting.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anne.
And thank you. I just wanted to, what came to mind after when Rick was talking and just ended with that beautiful quote from Rachel Remen. It reminded me of her work. And I also love just, we don't have to have all of the answers. And it reminded me of Rachel Remen's work where she talks about helping versus fixing versus serving. And then a lot of times in the midst of crisis, and in her work, she says, when you help, you see life as weak. When you fix, you see life as broken. And when you serve, you see life as whole. And fixing and helping being the work of the ego, and really service being the work of the soul. And I think of that often in this, of how you can serve. And a lot of the work is being present and instilling a lot of that care and compassion that then will be a safety net that can help people move forward. That was sort of just my initial thought after hearing the wonderful speakers this morning.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you so much for joining us. And then I'm going to ask Maria. Maria, you are living through this humanitarian crisis and trauma in Ukraine. Would you like to tell people a little bit about your work and about your experiences?
Yes, sure, John. I also have a presentation if you want me to share a couple of slides, but I can just, say a couple of things without the presentation. As I was listening to the speakers, I want to thank so much to Dr. Yasser and to Richard, because hearing again people who have experienced war and trauma for many years saying that care for the caregivers is so important. And this is what we have realized. My colleagues and I, we run a psychology center, and before the war, which started more than 4 months ago, we were more like soul development center. And when the war started, we turned actually into soul crisis center. And we ourselves realized that what Dr. Yasser was saying, that we as service providers were traumatized ourselves, and we needed a lot of support and healing. And what was very helpful to us, actually having this support from people who are outside of this trauma that we were in. And we had some mentorship and some healing sessions from psychotherapists from New Zealand, from the United States. And it really helped us a lot to continue our work and to be more resourceful for our clients. And we have also realized that when there is such a huge collective trauma, individual trauma is painful, but when it's coupled with a huge collective trauma, like the war in Ukraine, a lot of people are experiencing need for spiritual care. And this is what we also feel as psychotherapists, and we are learning from Christina, from Richard, the spirituality part. And we're now exploring different ways how we can add this component, this energy, this skills. It's actually a skill, right? How we can integrate this part into our work, because what I have realized, like classical psychotherapy is great, but there's something more. Maybe this is something more that I'm personally looking for. And I hear and see that our clients are also looking for something more. The questions which are directed to God, to spirit, this actually goes a little bit beyond the scope of classical psychotherapy. And I think we should look at definitely how to, the need is there, but the services are not there. So I'm constantly thinking, how can we, how we can expand this spiritual services to the people who do have the needs.
Thank you so much, Maria. And I'd just like you later on, I'm going to ask you about the storytelling project that you have started as well. But I think before we do that, I'd like to hand over to Christina. And Christina, you have done so much work in the field of spirituality and healthcare. And I would love to hear your views on providing the spirituality and spiritual care in these humanitarian crisis situations that are epitomized by conflict.
Thank you, Joan, very much. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this great panel. And as you can see, I'm so ecstatic that Rick is working with us at Jewish and that we can really, model that chaplain-clinician partnership, which I think is so key. So with a number of comments. First of all, I just heard, Maria, your excellent comments about psychologists and how psychologists can address this. So we do have in this country, I was just part of an NIH panel where a lot of psychologists are doing research on developing competencies for how psychologists can actually integrate religion and or spirituality in their therapy practice. So in one particular book, I believe I shared that at ISPEC, but for others, James Griffith is a psychiatrist who wrote Encountering the Sacred in Psychotherapy. And I think it's a wonderful book on how to integrate that. I couldn't help but notice with the first presentation, the biopsychosocial model. The biopsychosocial spiritual model started about over 100 years ago, but that domain seemed to have gotten lost because I think it's a little hard to figure out how to integrate it, but it is biopsychosocial spiritual. And all of those elements work together. So Maria, your comment about psychologists integrating it, absolutely psychologists, especially in these times, should be integrating. Nurses, doctors, everybody on the team should, and ideally, we would have someone like Rick who could be a partner. So, but I would encourage you to see that book, Encountering the Sacred in Psychotherapy. So, but psychology and spirituality are different as well. And I think when we look at bereavement, for example, there may be psychological aspects, there are often very deeply spiritual aspects. And when we're talking about trauma, in my opinion, I think the spiritual distress is huge. It's huge. And our job is being present to the patient and within our own clinical expertise to try to say how much of this is, say, depression that needs to be treated, how much of this is spiritual distress. But the spiritual or existential distress is huge. One's life is threatened. And also the beautiful presentation, the first presentation, I remember being on a panel with someone from the Gaza Strip, who is a WHO representative, and the suffering there is horrendous and it continues. So I think we have to be aware worldwide of this terrible suffering, but the existential and spiritual distress is huge, and how we open that space. At a previous meeting, Maria, the one that we recently did, and Rick was there, the question came up about compassion versus compassionate presence. And it's a fine line difference, but I just want to reiterate that here. Our compassion is our desire to relieve the other of suffering. And a lot of Joan Halifax's work, by the way, Zen Buddhist abbot, would be very helpful in this arena. So of course, compassion is the kindness we give to other people, loving kindness, that helping them with something, fixing might be okay in that compassionate realm, giving them the food they need, getting them shelter, all of these things are compassion. But also what Rick was talking about, what I talk about and others, is that stillness, the presence that we need for the accompaniment in another person. It doesn't mean that we're not talking, and it doesn't mean that it's going to be this transcendent moment and it's done. Certainly not that. But it's creating that space for the person to have their own voice, and knowing that we cannot in any way provide medication or treatment for that. But that companionship is huge. It's huge. I know my mother has shared many years of her story during World War II in Poland, and then after, when she escaped, the war was still going on, the loss of her husband. She shared those stories over and over to me all the way through until, you know, in her 90s, when she eventually died at 93. But the telling of those stories over and over were healing, you know. And obviously there was no answer. You have to listen to that, and just, you know, the stories, people find those answers. It may take years, but people find those answers. And I think that's what that compassionate presence is about. And it does require skill, and it does require us. And I've had to learn this myself, because I'm a trained physician. I love to get in there and do something that's going to help that person immediately. But it requires skill in boundaries. It requires skill in listening. It requires our own inner spiritual growth. That's key. And the last point I want to make is what Rick and you also mentioned, is our own self-care. We are really, I think, I know I'm not the best at it, because especially in the healing professions, it's other focused, right? But we can't take care of the other until we understand what's going on inside ourselves, and what is that existential other for us, be it God or however we see that, and how we carry that with us. You know, I just have a week off, and so I was cleaning this area where I have my altar, and it was a little too cluttered. And I delighted yesterday in really saying, what am I going to give away, and what am I going to keep on this altar? And that place of, even if it's a few minutes, that place where we can reconnect in silence with ourselves. So, and thank you again for all the work you all are doing.
Thank you, Christina, for such an eloquent explanation of the need for spirituality in healthcare. I think you and Rick make an amazing partnership, and such an example for the rest of us. Just maybe to say to everybody that this webinar is an hour and a half long, and so we have a couple of questions, and please, if you have a question, just put it into the chat. And Dr. Yasser, the first two are actually for you. Colin Cooper, he says to you, one of your images showed Dabka dancing. Professor Nigel Osborne believes that music can be a tool to combat stress, especially for children. He would go further and would claim music affects changes that can be seen by imaging. During the Cambodian War, I saw the beneficial effect of music and cultural re-engagement. Does music have a place in therapy in Gaza? Dr. Yusuf, if you'd like to answer that one.
Yeah, well, Dabka is a very important component in our life in Palestine. It's something that is cultural, something that traditional, something that is fun. It all the time brings happiness to the saddest moments. And whenever you are thinking of stress management, or whenever you are thinking of a recreational day or activities, whatever, of course, it will become on the top of your mind, you know. That's why whenever we have an activity that aims at helping people get out of the stressful life that we live and conditions that we live under, then Dabka is certainly one of the very first options to have. You know, whether you know how to do it or not, you know how to perform it, you just start jumping in there and you are just feeling happy. However, as music therapy, you know, as a let me say, as a solid single therapy point, it's not really, as far as I know, it's not applied in Gaza as a sole, you know, let me say, therapeutic intervention. In GCMHP, we have, for example, we have art therapy, but that's drawing, that's psychodrama, and that's play therapy. You know, that's what we do mainly with the children. I think that needs to be investigated. You know, whether music therapy would work or not in a place like Palestine. And I think I read also the second question. I'm not sure. I don't remember if you already read it, Joanne. It's about the spiritual aspects of yeah. Well,
please, I was just going to ask you to comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, spirituality is it's always there in the background of everything. You cannot really speak about healing or about therapy or about care without having spirituality in your mind. Even when we speak, for example, in CBT, the very traditional issue about let me say correcting, let me say faulty cognitive biases, or whatever we can call those very tough jargon words for me as a psychiatrist. So I think without really having some spirituality in your heart, you will not be able to overcome the challenges that you live under, because the mind will stop working, will stop functioning. Tell me how can humans understand that you are living in the 21st century with more than 7 decades of the Human Rights Declaration, and now we are living under an occupation that goes for 7 decades, and we are living under a blockade that goes for 15 years, and we live in the most recorded, reported, registered occupation that ever existed in history, and the international community is doing nothing about it. If you think about it just only using your mind, then you will go crazy, basically. You will not go to GCMHP, you will go to the psychiatric hospital even. But on the other hand, we have faith. We have the spiritual part of it, is that we know that justice will come one day, that injustice will never continue to be forever. That Palestinian people, like any other people in the world, one day we are going to have our freedom. It's never in the history that occupation will go endless. It's also it's our hope that our children are going to have a better future. It's our prayer that our children are going to have a better future. And there is a huge spiritual component around that. However, at the same time, we need really to be careful not to overuse the issue of religion or spirituality, because it sometimes do something that, like, it works on the opposite direction. Because sometimes when people get angry, why me? Why us? So we need to understand very well the person to whom we are talking, the family to whom we are talking, and then choose how we can address things and how we address issues. So this is what I could say in short. And thanks for the comments that I see. I think what we are doing is part of what we could do for our community in Gaza. I saw some of the friends. Thank you, Thalia, for being there. But I think unfortunately, as international community now, we used to say, if justice is not brought to Palestinian, then justice is not brought to any place in the world. It's one of the famous words that used to be said by Nelson Mandela. Justice, no justice in Palestine, it's no justice everywhere. Now we are seeing something terrible happening here and there. We have seen more difficult things happening around the world. We don't know what will happen in the future. And it's part of our faith, part of our understanding that you need to struggle and to stop all the human rights violations, to end up all the misbehavior of whoever is there, and to allow the humanity to live in peace.
Thank you, yes. And I think that is something that we would all really wish and continually pray for. And I think so much of what you're going through that Maria will see is going to be very similar to what they're experiencing in a much shorter period of time than you are in Palestine. And Rick, I wonder if you would like to comment on what Yasser has said. It's almost about why do bad things happen to good people, and why do these things happen? And how do you answer that question?
Yeah, well, how do I personally answer the question is, why do bad things happen to good people, is I don't know. What I do know is that I will stay with you as we go through this together.
Yes, and that's certainly something that we've seen with Ukraine, the importance of accompanying.
I find that the pat answers, the pithy answers, God never gives you more than you can handle, God needed another little angel in heaven, that's why your child died, are never helpful and usually very destructive. And so when I am faced with those huge theological existential questions, I don't know, but I can stay here with you.
And yes, thank you, Rick. There is no answer, is there? It's something that overwhelms us, and what we are seeing is that maybe just to say to people that we are with you, and that you're not alone. Christina, I don't know if you would like to add to that, to add to what Rick has said.
I completely agree with Rick, and I say that myself, or sometimes I just allow.
Danuka, lui. Ma
so sometimes I just, I do exactly what Rick just said, which is I don't answer it. I just sometimes just sit with that in silence with the person, because I find that if there's that silent space, and this is so typical of us here in the United States, that we chat all the time. I don't know if that's like that everywhere, but if we just add a few minute or two of silence, it really invites the other person to start talking about it for themselves. And many times people will just say something that's related. It's not an answer, but it moves to a sort of deeper question. So, when in doubt, someone told me, when in doubt, zip your mouth. Don't say anything. Just be there, be present. And often people have we all have an amazing ability to find answers for ourselves. If we're alone, it's tougher. So that presence and that accompaniment is key. Yeah. Jim, I want to make one comment. I was thinking about that in our first presentation. I think that when I started this back in the 90s, I remember a question which I'll never forget. And one of my colleagues, who was a Jewish physician and had a Muslim patient, said, I do not want to address spirituality or religion, because everyone thinks of it as religion in many cases, because it's going to cause a conflict between me and my patient, right? And I think that's not true, that it would cause a conflict, but as we've just heard, people are persecuted because of their religion, and there can be really, very divisive things as a result of that. So I think that's why I tend to really advocate a broader definition of spirituality. And so when I'm asking, I don't ask people what's your religion. I ask people, tell me a little bit, do you consider yourself spiritual? And people can answer that themselves. But I think we do need to be aware that religion has some charged issues with it, and that may prevent someone from asking. But I think it's important to include that spiritual domain, but be respectful. So in this country, we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We can't be saying we attend to diversity, equity, inclusion if we don't ask about spirituality, and if we don't hold a space open for religion and cultural practices too.
Thank you, Christina. I think this whole thing of finding meaning in what is happening around us, like the work of Viktor Frankl, is so important. So Maria, I wonder if I could ask you, what helps people when you're working with people who are going through such trauma at present? What are the things that help you and perhaps help those that you are helping?
I think what helped us is really having other people with us. And maybe what Rick said, that, we also had these questions, why these things are happening to us? Have we done anything wrong? Are we so bad as a nation that we deserve genocide? And these are the questions that probably nobody has an answer to, but having people who were with us, who were expressing support and solidarity in different parts of the world in so many different ways, was really something that was giving us a lot of hope and light and courage and just energy to live, actually. Because when the war started, we have seen so many horrible things happening, and our mind got very like flooded with really terrible and scary images, sounds, and information. And to have something else, not only these horrors, it was very important for us just to really just to get up in the morning knowing that there will be Joanne sharing an image, you know, of something beautiful on Facebook, to see some other people who would do something to say, hey guys, we see that what's happening to you is really bad and we're with you. Maybe we will plant some flowers in blue and yellow colors. Maybe we will put Ukrainian flag, I don't know, just as a symbol, you know, on our Facebook that we are with you. So definitely people. I think that this disaster that is happening in Ukraine was created by people, but having other people was also something that helped us a lot. And what also helped us as a team, that we could continue doing our work, that we had our team, we had our ideas, we could still be together, although we had our own challenges, but our work was something that was actually giving us meaning. And when we were asking ourselves, okay, if this is our last day, I decided my mission will be to do some communication and advocacy. So I decided if today, you know, the missile would hit my house, at least I will do everything I could to counteract, because we know that Russian propaganda is very strong. So I thought, okay, let me share the information from Ukraine about what's happening in Ukraine. So having some kind of activities and doing some kind of actions and being able to continue doing the work is something that was giving us meaning, and that what helped me not to be in a frozen state. And we know that when trauma is happening, this classical response, freeze, flight, or fight. So for me, actually being active, maybe I was hyperactive, but I decided that it was better than I would just freeze. So other people, my colleagues, my mom, my brother, actually fellow Ukrainians, to see how much love actually we have as a nation, and how actually many Ukrainians stood up together against what was happening. Humor, art, music, and looking for beauty. I was consciously and deliberately looking for beauty every day. Flowers, churches, trees, plants, birds, beautiful skies, sunset, nice cake, you know, a beautiful child, anything. So these were like my personal tools. And speaking about our clients, what we found was helpful. We were doing initially more individual work. We started Crisis Center, offering our services for free to people who need mental health and psychological support. So actually, and this project also gave us meaning, that we wanted to be of service to others. So seeing this project growing, seeing that some people started contacting us, started reaching out and having a feeling that we can be of value and of service to others. And definitely in this last 4 months, we were working in a different way, not like we did before, but what we noticed that before, our clients would be more often people who would need like long-term support and maybe therapy and counseling, but because it was a crisis, so we were more often engaging with people on a short-term basis, 1, 2, 3, 5 sessions. And very often people had to take decisions to leave the country or to stay or do something. So actually, I think that even these short-term sessions, short-term counseling and psychological work, we see the value of it. And what we're starting now is different formats of group sessions. And here we see our role more as like holding the space. So people can come together and just share their stories. We have a bit of a framework and structure how we want to do it, but we understand that the war actually is breaking and destroying the connection. And for people to come together into one relatively safe space, emotionally safe space, and to be able to share the stories, to hear the stories of others, this is something that helps people to restore that connection with each other, with their own feelings. So I think that different formats can be helpful: individual work, group work, storytelling, art, and just some people say that we haven't contacted you yet, but we know that you are there, and it's already, you know, it's kind of good. So we know that if we need help, you are there.
Thank you, Maria. And I think this whole issue of connectivity, connection, and service. And Yosef, I wonder if you would like to comment on what Maria said about being of service to others, helping in this kind of situation from your experience.
Well, you know, it's very ironic, but sometimes very simple, positive things do help a lot of people and turn their mind, you know, from thinking negatively about their realities and the future to thinking positively. For example, one of the things that we all the time tell people is to look at their children, you know, that they are performing well at school, that they are doing their best, that they are happy, you know, that your children are growing okay. It's really crazy, but sometimes you just celebrate that you are fine, you know, that people just woke up healthy, you know. I mean, what others feel that this is something that occurs by default, sometimes you just celebrate having them, you know, which is, you know, it's like a saying that sometimes the sick doesn't, I mean, the healthy doesn't feel how important it is to be healthy unless until he or she becomes sick, you know. And one of the ironic things that we kept saying during the last 3 years is that COVID-19 brought to the international community the blockade on Gaza Strip, you know, because people were, people had to stay in their homes. They were having difficulties traveling around. They were having difficulties even meeting their beloved ones, something that is one way or the other similar to what we are living for 15 years in Gaza. So this is very important when you try to identify positive things in people's life. Sometimes it's hard, but in many times it's easy to find something that you can build on and change the way they look at life. And then I would say that it's important to include the people around the patient or about the client or the one who's receiving counseling into our intervention, you know, because you sit with the person 1 hour a week, maybe 2 hours a week, but then there is a whole family. There are brothers, sisters, husband, wife, sons, daughters, fathers, mothers, etc., that you need really to bring into therapy or into counseling. You need to tell them what's happening, you know. Sometimes telling them what's happening just calm them down and make them involved in therapy, especially when we talk about children. You know? So there are, you need to be passionate about your work. And that's something that is not easy to have, by the way. That's why we all the time say that care for caregivers or supportive supervision is very important component. You need to come in the morning with your heart and with your mind, you know. You have to be spiritually fit in order to be able to help others, you know. You need to dig into their lives in order not to find secrets, but in order to find hopes, you know. And you need to just start lightening candles here and there, here and there, and here and there. And the human people, I mean, we humans are really, I think, driven towards a life, you know, more than anything else. You need just someone who can just help you one way or the other, you know. And in a place like Gaza, you know, Palestine, the issue of stigma, it's a lot improving, you know, but it's still there, you know. Sometimes you only find people who are really suffering a lot, that they have no other choice but come to therapy. They are not coming just because they have symptoms. And then with those, you really have a big problem, because then with those, you really need to find something good to take them out of their, you know, terrible feelings, out of their living conditions. So sometimes it's very, I wouldn't say very easy, but you can find a way to, or a path for therapy with your patient. Sometimes it's more difficult than that. And to end up with something, you know, this conversation, you know, it's important that this is a very rewarding, it's very exhaustive. psychologically very exhaustive, mentally it's very exhaustive, spiritually very exhaustive work to be a therapist, but at the same time, it's very rewarding, because you see when you are successful that things really have changed, that the lives of children or adults have changed a lot. And that you can claim one day that you have really helped that family or this person go out of despair and continue to their life. Stop thinking about suicide and moving forward with their lives, thinking not negatively about their children, think positively, etc., etc. So in a sense, it's difficult, demanding task or work, but on the other hand, it's one way or the other rewarding.
Yes, so thank you so much. I think you've brought together so beautifully your message and Father Rick's message. And I think you're talking about people who are passionate about what they do. I think you, Father Rick, Christina, Maria, and have really highlighted to us how important it is to have not only this passion for what we do, but this huge compassion to get out there and do something to make life better, even in the worst of situations. So really, it's my huge pleasure to say thank you, deep thank you to each and every speaker, to you, Yasser, to Rick, to Christina and Maria and Anne. I think you've given us so much to think about and so many messages to take home. And so I would just like to say thank you to everyone who's here today, to highlight to you that just today, we have launched on the ICPCN e-learning channel is a new series of training courses, e-learning training courses on palliative care for children in humanitarian settings. And to say that our next webinar, it will be on the 19th of October, and we will be looking at palliative care in disasters. And just remembering that palliative care and humanitarianism, they really meet in the relief of suffering. So I really want to say thank you to everyone today. I'm going away hugely encouraged, and I just have so much to think about as I go forward into my evening. I don't know if any of my other colleagues here, Megan, Moira, Rick, would like to say anything to add to this before we sign off. No?
I
So
think
thank you,
just agree with you. Thank you, Joan. I was just going to say agree with you, and thank you, Joan, for hosting. If you are thinking I'd love other colleagues to have been part of this, there is a chance for them to join tomorrow. It's the same seminar. Father Rick will be asleep, we hope, and he's recorded his, but Dr. Yasser has agreed to come in person, and we'll have a different panel. So please do share that. We'll just put the link in the chat there for you to invite other people along tomorrow. And John, there was a lot of chat about how people could find out more, and I've just been emphasizing in the chat, join PalChase, look on the network, and we really would love your input going forward. Yeah.
Yes, we would love all of you to join us in PalChase in promoting palliative care in humanitarian settings, and membership is free. And there are many opportunities for you to not only to learn more, but to contribute through the different activities that we are involved with. And we are part of the global palliative care movement with a specific focus. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Moira, for highlighting all those things. Thank you, Megan, for all the tech behind the scenes, and Julia for all that you've been doing. And again, a huge thank you to Yasser, to Father Rick, to Christina, to Maria, and to Anne for being here with us and sharing your wisdom.